And is there a, thanks, Dean. I paid him a little extra. And no, there's no test for that, for those continuing education credit. So let me get my clicker. Real quick. Hold on. There we go. Uh-oh. Did I get it? All right. So some of the things that we're going to talk about today is the importance of knowing what's on your network and how we're going to secure it, right? Because we can't secure things that we don't know about. So it's really important. The foundation of your security is really going to start with what's on your network, what's connecting. So that's important. We're going to talk about those detection methods, best practices, specific options across the industry. I am going to talk a little bit about how Forescout does it. Checking for compliance. I think when we think of compliance, we think of HBSS and ACAS, but compliance really should be across all of your devices, right? Even devices that don't hold an agent. So there is a compliance level for a printer or a network device or other things that are connecting. So we're going to talk a little bit about those compliance checks and best practices, and then automating that control, sharing information across the security ecosystems. I realize that it only kicks in when I talk this way, right? So I'm going to be profile the whole time. So the importance, right, of once we do all of this checks, once we know what's on our network, we know the compliance level, how do we share that across our entire ecosystem to really make it stronger, right? So we're going to talk about some examples, some of the things that we're looking for in our tools and how to make them work better together. And then I'll leave some time at the end for questions. So what do you see here? What are some of the things in these pictures? SCADA controls, printers, medical stuff, right? Do you know what we see? We see attack vectors for our adversaries, right? These are all things that are connecting to the network, right? Specifically, these pictures came from one of our customers, which is the Navy ship Hospital Mercy. They use Forescout to identify everything that's connected to their network. Some of these devices, like the heart monitor, that actually leaves the ship and goes onto the beach and connects back via Wi-Fi. That's out of their control, right? So that once it goes out there, they need to still know that it's connected. They still need to control it. They need to know what's connecting to it. It actually has an embedded Windows operating system. There's a thumb drive that can connect into it. So there's some monitoring that has to continually happen, even though it's not physically inside the ship. So this is what we're seeing really across all the services, not just the hospitals, but we're seeing SCADA devices connect. If you think back going through your office and going through your workplace, how many things are connecting to the internet or connecting to your network, right? We see elevators, security cameras, key fobs. These are all things that are grabbing an IP. So let's take a minute to talk about some of the security challenges. If you look at all the major breaches that have happened in the news recently, many of them are happening because of breaches into the SCADA environment, right, or industrial control systems, or non-standard devices. And the idea is that these are some really old pieces of equipment, right? Pieces of equipment that can't be patched and have very little monitoring. They can't run an agent. Right? These are the weakest link in the network. So this is where the adversaries are coming in. They're attacking into the SCADA network and then moving laterally to try to gain access into more important information. So really, this is a huge security hole for our teams. The other major challenge is the amount of devices that are changing. Right? We're not just seeing Windows devices, Mac, and Linux, but we're seeing all sorts of IoT, right? This is the new hot term, Internet of Things. And really, as you walk through, we're now seeing TVs on the network, video cameras, right? Video teleconferencing. We plug an appliance in and see all sorts of new devices that are trying to connect, mobile handheld devices, right? All these Internet of Things. The number here, it says 2020, 20 billion endpoints. I actually just saw 2 days ago 30 billion endpoints. Next week, it's going to be 40 billion. I mean, we're just seeing so many new devices that are connecting to the network. We used to trying to estimate architecting a solution. And I remember 5 years ago, we used to say, oh, if you have, for every user, you probably have 2, maybe 3 endpoints. We're now seeing for every user, there's about 5 to 6 endpoints, right? If you just sit down at your desk, the number of things that are connecting, it's not just your desktop anymore. It's your VoIP phone. Maybe you have a handheld device that's connecting. You have a printer or any other wireless device that's in your office. These are all things that are attaching to the network, which are now potentially a threat. So it's important that we know about it, track it, and monitor it. Right? The other part with all these new devices is that they can't hold a device, or an agent. So if we look at our traditional methods in securing the endpoints that are out there, it's typically around either an agent that has to sit on the endpoint and talk back to a centralized server, or it's a scan that happens on our network, right? For these devices, we can't run an agent on it. So visibility is very difficult. So I want to talk about best practices. When we look at tools to secure our network, and we talk about visibility and knowing what's on our network, the large majority of tools are around managed devices. That's the easy part, right? That's the low-hanging fruit. We can all manage those devices because they're managed. We know what's running on them. We know where they are on the network, right? What about the unmanaged devices? This is not just people coming in or contractors coming in, but think about anything that has an agent that the agent broke. It went bump in the night, or it missed the agent. Or we get a lot of confusion around whether services, a server really needs HBSS. You know, people have different interpretations of what needs HBSS and what doesn't, what needs an agent. All of those devices that are not running an agent and are not managed are considered unmanaged. That's a huge gap, a huge hole in our security process. Same thing with those IoT devices. If you're relying on tools that require an agent or a scan, IoT is very difficult, right? So when we look at tools for visibility, we want to make sure that we are looking at tools that handle all three categories, not just one category, but we see managed, unmanaged, and all those specialty devices that are out there, right? Because that's the foundation, knowing what's connecting to your network. So when I say see those devices, what do I mean? Because a lot of tools will say, all right, I can see that device. I can see everything that connects to your network. The problem is what do they see? They see a MAC address, an IP address. Is that good enough? Can you set policy around a MAC and IP? We don't really know what that device is. We just know there's a device there, but we don't know what the device is. Is that good enough? Probably not. When we say see, we want to see the whole picture, right? We want to see that, we want to know how it connected to the network, the admission event. Sure, the MAC and IP is important, but I also want to know the network traffic, maybe the switch port that it connected to. That could be important when I want to know where it is on the network. But I also need to be able to classify the device. I need to know, is that a printer? Is it an MRI machine? Is it a pharmaceutical dispensing unit? Is it a security camera? Is it a Mac, a Linux? So classifying that device and knowing more about the device is very important. What protocols is it running? What ports are open? Who's it talking to on the network? One of the things that we see with SCADA devices is that they generally all talk back to a centralized server. Some of the devices, depending. If you have meters that are thermostats that are talking on the network, maybe talking back to a centralized server. That's important information to know when classifying those devices. Because if I start to see that thermostat talking to a different IP, I need to know that. So visibility is key. It's not just that the device exists, but what it's doing on the network is very important when setting policy, right? So baby heart monitors, X-ray machines in a hospital. They talk back to a centralized server, ports and protocols. I need to know that. A printer, it's classified as a printer. If I now see it talking over port 80, that's important information to know, isn't it? Right? I now need to know that it's no longer acting like a printer. So in today's day and age, when we talk about knowing that there's an IP and a MAC, how easy is it to spoof a MAC address? Right. Pretty sure my 6-year-old can Google it and at least get the first couple steps on doing it. So it happens. It's important to know more about that device. And so not just classifying, but if we can also assess that device, maybe learn a little bit more about what's happening. For a Windows device, I do need to know what's happening. What's the patch level? Is it compliant? Is it running the agents I need it to run? Right. So a little bit more information about what's happening for that endpoint. Is there a firewall running? How's that network adapter configured? Right. So some visibility into the device is also important if we can gather it. So I want to take a second and just talk about how Forescout does it. So as I mentioned, I didn't do a full introduction of myself, but I am the Director of Systems Engineering at Forescout. Forescout's what I know best. I'm going to give some examples on how Forescout does it, but the takeaway that I want you to leave here with is these are some of the things that you should be looking for when you're looking for tools to secure your network. All right. So from a Forescout perspective, visibility is key. The first step, polling your network infrastructure, right? Not relying on an agent, not doing a scan, but actually talking to your switched infrastructure, talking to your routers, knowing what's connecting, right? Any entry point into the network. So even if it's a VPN-connected device, if it's a wireless access point, I need to be talking about to those devices so I know in real time when a device connects to my network. Receiving SNMP's traps, right? So we register to receive those traps. Now I know if I have, for instance, sometimes we'll see in a medical world, we'll see a remote clinic. I don't necessarily want to put a sensor or an appliance out at that site, but I can talk to that switch and receive traps. So at that remote location, a device gets plugged in. I know immediately that something has now plugged into the network. Right? So being able to receive traps is also key in real-time visibility. .1x requests. .1x is a whole other subject we could probably spend a couple days on, but it's another way to see devices that are connecting, right? .1x is an authentication protocol, lets you onto the network. So if my switches are configured for .1x, being able to see that authentication and knowing when devices connect, and if they failed, and if they use .1x or MAC-off bypass. So for those engineers, network engineers that might be here that have to deal with .1x, knowing that it connected with MAC-off bypass is really important because all that stuff I just mentioned about printers acting like printers and SCADA devices acting like SCADA devices, they get on the network using MAC-off bypass. If they got on using MAB, I want to make sure that they continue to act in the classification that they were put on as, right? That's really important. DHCP, monitoring those requests, we don't want to rely completely on that because not all devices will use DHCP or someone can have a static address, but it is one additional way. So having multiple methods is important. Monitoring span port. This is allowing me to see what those devices are actually doing. All of that client-server traffic, that network traffic, those ports and protocols. Running an Mmap scan. Right? We don't necessarily want to do this on all of our devices, but it might give us some further intelligence on unmanaged devices. Right? So I now know what the operation is, what the function is. Using credentials, one of the things about Forescout is that we are agentless, right? We don't require a piece of software to be on your devices to see them, but being able to remotely log in using a service account will allow us visibility into that device to give you that further assessment that I mentioned earlier. NetFlow data, another way to see what's happening at a remote location. We can receive the NetFlow data. There are cases, if you have a MAC address, I've gone into some sites that say, oh, we manage every single MAC address that connects to our network. And they, no kidding, I went to an Air Force base, they had a book this big that had all their MAC addresses listed and what those devices were. It's a good starting point. So you have to be able to import that kind of data. If you have a tool that's looking for determining whether or not devices are allowed to be on the network, being able to import addresses is important. And then if there is a need for an agent to have the ability to do that. I don't want to bash agents because when you look at tools like HBSS and you have a framework that's running, there's a lot of very good detailed information that can provide about that endpoint and provide security. So there's a definite purpose for agents. However, we don't want to rely on them completely for visibility because agents go bump in the night. Okay? Questions on this piece? All right, so just to tie it all together, we're tying in who connects to the network. So using some sort of integration with Active Directory, I want to know who's on that endpoint. I want to know what's connecting to the network. And I want to know where it's connecting to the network. Right? So all of this information is really important as we talk about policy and whether or not these devices should be allowed on the network. Having this type of granular data is key when we start talking about policy. I want to know who's logged on, right? If it's a VIP, maybe I don't take the same action as an airman, right? I need that type of granularity. If they are connecting from a remote location, maybe a switch that's in a deployable kit in a tactical environment, they're connecting out there. I don't want to take the same action as if they're connecting to my headquarters, right? So having that granularity is important when we talk about automation. And then, of course, who, what, where. I I think I covered, posture, of course. And what's happening on that endpoint, right? There's going to be some critical vulnerabilities that we want to take action on immediately versus one that might just need a small patch that we can push down in the background. So all that important information, right? All this contextual data we're gathering about the endpoints. This is what we say is C. When we talk about visibility and you're out there looking for tools or using your existing tools, when you talk about seeing the network, those are the things you should be asking for. Not just give me a MAC and an IP. I want to see. I want everything, right? We kind of call it the oh wow factor, right? Because when you finally get that visibility and see everything that's connecting, wow is usually not the word that comes out of the person's mouth, but I'll use it in the PG access. So the next step, right? So we got all this great information. I want to talk about control. This is usually where people get a little bit uncomfortable in their seats because people don't like that word control, right? When you hear the word control, what do you think of? If I tell you I'm going to control your device, what's the first word that comes to mind? Anyone? NAC. NAC is a bad word with a lot of people because it means blocking, right? When I hear the word control, it means I'm going to block that device. And it doesn't have to mean that. I think NAC was given a bad word. NAC, as in network access control, was given a bad word, kind of deemed a bad word several years ago because it was difficult to deploy. Control doesn't have to be about blocking. Control can be about notifying. You can take this sort of crawl, walk, run approach, right? So when you're looking for tools and you think about control, it doesn't have to be black or white. Maybe I just want to notify that device. I want to control it by letting it know that it's out of compliance, letting that user know. Many times that user has no idea. I think we saw at one location, they were plugging in these little fans into their USB port. And they have little storage devices on that fan, right? There's a BIOS in it, and it connects in. For whatever reason, HBSS wasn't catching it. It didn't see it as an external device. But it certainly was flagging in our system. We were seeing this device, and they said, well, wait, it's just a fan. What is a fan going to do? We also just recently saw one of those vapor cigarettes. Someone was charging it on their laptop. HBSS didn't catch it, but it was plugged in, and it's still considered a storage device. So letting the user know first before we take some sort of crazy action on their endpoint is important. So let's just notify them. We can limit them without blocking them. Right? We can take sort of an intermediate action on that endpoint. And then, of course, ultimately, there's going to be cases where you want to block that device, completely take it off the network. So I'd like to just get a little bit more granular on what those options are. Because I think when people think about controlling a device, a lot of times they're thinking about the host. Like we're notifying on the host end, which is sending an email or redirecting, if you have a captive portal, redirecting them to a specific web page. But when we talk about notifying, it also might mean notifying on a network level. Maybe we're letting the person's boss know of the infraction, right? Or we're just telling other systems or other tools, right? Something has happened on the network, and I want to open a help desk ticket. That's just a notifying, right? It's part of control, but I need to open a ticket to track it. Right? From a limit perspective, again, there's limitations you can take on your host and limitations from the network side. From a host perspective, it just might be, hey, we found an application that's installed, and I want to remove that application. I'm not going to quarantine you. I'm not going to block your access, but I need to be able to remove that violating software, right? Or I might want to push a patch, check for an IOC, an indicator of compromise. From a network perspective, it might be something simple. I'm not going to block you, but you connected to the guest wireless, and you really should have been connected to the corporate wireless. It's not the same, and there's no reason for you to be connecting GFE to the guest wireless, right? Automatically move that over to the corporate, and you should have those policies, those security policies applied to your endpoint. Little things like that. Not blocking you, just correcting your actions. Right? And then, of course, there's going to be the case where we want to block something. Whether on the host, it's a peripheral device that's connecting, detecting something like a dual home device that might be connected wireless and to the network. We might take action to turn that off, turn off the NIC. Quarantining the device from a network perspective. providing a ACL, an access control list. So being able to communicate directly to the network infrastructure is key when we're talking about blocking these devices, right? And I want to add that when you look at tools, they shouldn't be mutually exclusive, right? We don't want to take action on an end user without also doing the notify. That's only going to increase your help desk calls, right? You start blocking people, and the first thing they're going to do is pick up the phone and make a phone call. So think of a combination of these when you start thinking about controlling your endpoints. Questions? A combination of notifying and limiting and block. So before you block someone, unless it's an absolute rogue device, but maybe you're blocking someone because they've violated a policy, an IA policy 3 times, right? So you can set trackers. The first time, I'm just going to send you an email and tell you that you're out of compliance. The second time, I'm going to send you and your boss an email automatically. And then the third time, I'm actually going to block your access out to the internet or to the network. And I'm going to redirect you to your IA contract that you signed. That's actually a policy that exists with one of our customers today at one of the hospitals. It's all automated, no human intervention, but they actually track how many times someone violates an IA policy. If they violate it 3 times, it automatically cuts off their network access based upon policy, and they're redirected to, they have to take another test, and it goes down a whole nother path. So when I say use a combination, right, we don't just want to take action on a user if we can actually let them know, because it avoids that call to the help desk. Questions? All right, so we have all this great information we've gathered about these endpoints, right? We have this great security tool that we've chosen. How do we get it to work in our environment to its best of its ability? And that's where Orchestrate comes in. So the problem today is you have all these security tools, but they're all siloed, right? They do each one of their jobs really, really well. HBSS works well. ACAS does their scanning, tells you about your vulnerability assessments. You have your SIM products. Each one is working in its own silo. Well, the problem with that is that as we get alert and inform, which a lot of our tools are today, right? It's alert and inform. Think about HBSS. If an AV event happens, what does it do? Alert and informs you. AV event, AV event. There's no correlating action that takes place, right? So a lot of your tools are just alert and inform. That requires a human to go in and look at the log and then go over to this tool and say, okay, where is it on the network? All right, I found it on the network. Now what am I going to do? Oh, I got to patch it. So let me go out to SCCM or BigFix or whoever I'm using for my patching, and let me patch that device. It's a lot of human intervention, right? So the problem with this is that with our security breaches, sometimes we see that these are identified in a log where a human just never got around to it, right? So we see that, I'm going to use OPM as a perfect example. We saw that breach was actually detected almost a year earlier, but the staff was so overwhelmed with all of these alerts that they couldn't keep up with it, and they basically, it sat there for about a year. And we're seeing this over and over again. I think we just saw the average breach is 300 days, average time to contain it, right? I thought somewhere there's a statistic, but I think it's like 300 days to identify it, and then once it's identified, then they have to contain it, right? It's another 31 days to contain it. So this is all because it's just humans, right? Humans have to go from tool to tool. So this is the challenge that we're faced with today. And when we look at IoT, originally, all of our security products were based here, right? But now our attack vector is across all of them. And we have to protect them all. So the problem that we have here is that each vertical is coming up with its own products, its own devices, its own standards, its own protocols, and there's nothing that ties them together. And we're mixing them. In our workplace, we're seeing a mix of devices and vendors. So we need a tool or tools that are able to talk to each other, right? Make this seamless. Don't have separate tools for each vertical. I found this slide very overwhelming, right? And I guarantee that this slide was created a few months ago. It would be double today. All right, so let's take a minute to talk about orchestration. So I got all this great information. Again, I'm going to use Forescout as an example, but the key here is what you're looking for is a very robust policy engine. So on our network, we have all of these data providers, right? Tools that are giving me lots of data. And whether that's my FireEye or Bromium or whoever your threat detection product is that you're using, if you're using mobile devices and you have a mobile device management, like a MobileIron or an AirWatch, all of these tools are gathering information about the devices on your network. They can be data providers into your policy engine, right? This is information that you should have a tool that can absorb this information about everything else that's happening. Because there's not going to be one product that does it all, right? You're going to have an ATD product that does that very well. You're going to have a vulnerability assessment tool that does that very well. What you want is the results of those tools to be able to feed into a policy engine where you can make automated, important decisions based upon that information. And automation's a key, because never have I ever heard a company say, or an organization say, I have too many people. That's okay, here you can take some, right? We need to use our people wisely, and we need to automate, which is those functions that can be automated. So providing that information from data providers. We can also pull, as I mentioned earlier, visibility. We can pull information from network devices, right? Any entry point into the network, any network admission point. So wireless access points, switches, VPNs. I can also gain a ton of information about my endpoints, which we've already talked about. And all of this information feeds into a policy engine. The tools that are gathering, these agent-based tools that are gathering very detailed information about my endpoints, should be able to feed into your policy engine too. So you need a platform that's an open platform that allows open APIs and ways to transmit information back and forth. And then you need a policy engine which can gather all this information and allow you to have very granular decisions on what to do with that information, right? Do I want to take action? Is this a critical vulnerability? And then in the end, you're going to have tools that can also benefit from this information, right? What about those SIM products that are out there? Or other tools that are scan-based tools? Maybe they could benefit from real-time information, right? What if when a scanner, it scans once a week, and you can tell it immediately when a new device comes in, scan this now. Don't wait until next Tuesday. So making those time-based scans real-time makes them more valuable. Let's talk about HBSS for a minute. I mentioned earlier, it's alert and inform. Something happens, alert and inform. What if there's a critical AV event, and HBSS could feed information into a policy engine and say, this endpoint right here had a critical event. And you had a policy engine that said, oh, I know the exact switch port that's connected to. I know the user who's onto it. So I'm going to send the user a message, let them know we're going to quarantine them, and then I'm going to talk to SCCM to make sure that they have the most recent patches on that endpoint, right? A policy engine that can dictate all of that, automate all of it for you. Oh, and meanwhile, I'm going to open a ticket for you too, so I can tell you what's happening on your endpoint. So Forescout specifically, we have about 70 vendors we do this with. We have an open platform. So this is just a quick snapshot of some of the verticals in which we integrate with. I'll try not to do my sales pitch here, but the idea is that we're at 70, we're growing far more than that, but having an open platform allows us to integrate with any tool that's on the network, right? If there's information to be absorbed, we can absorb it, and then we can also feed information to other tools. And it just makes the entire ecosystem that much stronger when you can automate that process. Right? At our booth, I don't know. The question was, is that the same slide that was at the booth? Yeah, so this is just a snapshot of the idea of when you start thinking about tools that would benefit from the information that's consumed and provided. So this is just a snapshot. Like I said, there's 70. And do quick math, I don't think there's 70 on there. Yeah. Yeah. You swing by the booth at the end, I'm sure we can give you every single one that we currently have today. I'm trying to take you through a quick example to kind of help it all sink in. And this is an integration that we have with vulnerability assessment tools. And there's multiple out there. We don't discriminate. We're agnostic. But the idea is when a device connects to the network, Forescout can go out, and it can request the vulnerability assessment tool to run a scan. But better yet, we can actually go out to that scanner and say, when was the last time you scanned this endpoint? Was it in the last 7 days? Because if someone's been TDY for 60 days, and they join the network on a Wednesday, and you did your scan on a Tuesday, that endpoint's going to sit until the following Tuesday before it gets scanned again. So by using that real-time network admission that we talked about in the beginning, when a device joins the network, go out to the vulnerability assessment tool and say, when was the last time you scanned this endpoint? If it was not in the last 7 days, scan it now. So in this particular case, we scan it now. And I went wrong way. So it scans the system, and it sends the results back to the Counteract. Now, the policy, Counteract is our product. It's Forescout's appliance. But think of it as a policy engine. So we've now scanned the device. We're sending that information back to the policy engine. Policy engine says, all right, it's non-compliant. I want to isolate it into a VLAN. So now, because we can talk to the network infrastructure, we can isolate, quarantine that endpoint. We can then do a full scan on it, or we can go out to, if we've determined that it's missing a patch, we can go out to your patch management tool and say, please send out any pending patches to this endpoint, whether that's SCCM, BigFix, whatever you're using for patching. Then we do the full scan. It says it's been remediated, and then we move it back onto the production network. So all of this without any human interaction, right? The idea is this policy is set up to say whenever we find a device that hasn't been on the network in the last 7 days and received a scan, if we find a critical vulnerability, we want to take actions A, B, and C, and then move it back to production network when it's compliant, right? So the whole idea behind this is comply to connect. For those of you who are familiar with the program, the idea is to first check the device. So .1x, I mentioned it earlier. .1x is very black or white. You're either on the network or off the network, but it's not checking for compliance. So it's important to have a tool that's able to check also for the compliance before it allows you on the network, right? So comply to connect, that's the idea. Before a device comes on the network, I want to make sure that HBSS is installed, it's running, that HIPS is configured, Audit Manager is configured, all of the components are configured, and that it's communicating back to the EPO server. Same thing with ACAS, right? Any of my agent-based tools, if I want to make sure that SCCM is installed, that it's actually talking to the SCCM server, it's receiving its updates. These are all important automated checks for Comply to Connect. Questions? So this is a pretty straightforward one with the AV. I want to talk a little bit more about maybe a little bit more in-depth one, because one of the things that we're seeing is a tool that has a lot of information, especially when we talk about IOCs, that information can actually be used to make other endpoints stronger and other tools stronger. We're even seeing now across agencies having IOCs shared from one agency to the next, right? And several programs to do that. The idea being that an infected system connects to the network. It tries to call home. The ATD can block that outbound traffic and then creates an IOC for that endpoint that's been compromised. And it can send the information about the IOC to Forescout, right? So ATD's done its job. It's identified that something's trying to call out. It's identified the IOC, and it's stopped it. What next? Now what? Maybe there's 10, 20, 100 other devices that have that same IOC. By sending that information to Forescout, we can isolate the infected system. We add that IOC information to a scanner database, right? And that's actually within Forescout. Right. Then we can look for other endpoints on the network that have that same IOC. Isolate those endpoints that have the IOC. Remediate them. And now allow them, once they've been remediated, back onto the network. And again, the idea here, the important part is it's all automated. These are policies that are in place that can identify it and fix it for you. Questions? So to summarize, when looking at your tool set, you're looking for tools that are capturing a lot of data about visibility, right? Not just MAC and IP, but I want to know context about that endpoint. What is it? What is it doing on my network? Is it compliant, right? Doing a scan of the network, doing a ping sweep, looking for MACs and IPs, it's not good enough, right? It's just telling me if something exists there. And quite frankly, something can plug in and unplug in between scans and you never see it. So it's important when you look for tools that you're looking for tools that can give you that real-time information and give you the complete visibility. So we're going to collect all this data. We're going to do real-time mapping, right, of all that information. So now we know the who, what, where it is on the network, and the posture of that endpoint. And then we're going to use our policy enforcement engine to be able to automate, right? Automate that next step. If we rely on a human to go out and look at a breach, it could take a year. But automating it, looking in the next step, just getting more information about that endpoint will increase the security posture across your organization. All right. Did we cover everything? I think we covered the importance of knowing what's on your network. We talked about lots of different detection methods, right? Scans are okay, agents are okay, but we really need something that integrates with the network fabric to tell you in real time when devices are connecting and how they're connecting. Checking for compliance. Compliance does not just mean information assurance. I know we think HBSS, ACAS. It's also compliant of all those other devices. Is your printer compliant? Is it talking over ports it shouldn't be talking over? If I see port 80, it's not compliant, right? Is my thermostat on the wall talking to an IP address that's it's not supposed to be talking to? That's all compliance. And it's important to monitor that. Automating control, just so we catch things faster. We have that next step. Sharing information across your ecosystem. Questions? So, anyone who's still awake? Yes, sir.
How much network overhead does the ForScout system add to your?
So the question was how much, I'll repeat it. It's okay, Dean. How much overhead does ForScout add to your network communications? And I'm going to give you the classic engineering answer, which is depends. It depends on how you use the product. I will tell you from a pure discovery and discovering all that information, there's no impact on the network. The reason why is we use algorithms that are passive. Right? We're first trying to passively identify, we can receive traps, which could potentially, but using that monitor port and then communicating directly to the switches, we pull ARP tables and MAC addresses, very little overhead. However, now you start using policies and next steps and you start pushing things out, then it could potentially have an impact. But we typically have policies tweaked to have very little impact on the network. The favorite one? Well, I think, I know, there's each one. There's that one, but then I think maybe, were you thinking this one? SIM, your monitoring tool here, like your ArcSight, your Splunk, SIEM. Vulnerability assessment. Your endpoint tools. Endpoint, it's going to be like where your HBSS or AV. Your patch management tools and your enterprise management tools. So your mobile tool, I'm sorry, your enterprise mobility management tools, I think is EMM. So that's like your MDMs.
So of those areas, could you, okay, there's 1, 2, there's 7 of them. Which are the top 2 or 3 in terms of interaction
with our tool? So the question was, yeah, in DoD network specifically. The question was, within these categories, what's the most commonly common buckets that interact with our tool? And I will say, hands down, the biggest integrations are with HBSS, right, which is going to be the endpoint, and ACAS, which is going to be your VA, your vulnerability assessment. So endpoint, vulnerability assessment, and then I would add the patch management is probably the next one when we talk about automation, right? Yes, exactly. Yep. Those are the ones that come up. And to be honest, those were actually the leading integration. So I've been with ForScout about 6 years, and the very first integration that we ever did 6 years ago was with EPO, and it was the Air Force that pushed us. They said we're going to use, it was a project with AETC, and they said, look, we have McAfee, we're forced to use HBSS, and we want to purchase ForScout. We want the two to work together. And I was actually the engineer that sat in the room with our developers and their developers, and we said, how can we make the two products stronger together? And one of the use cases that the Air Force gave us was, when you find a rogue device out there, we want you to automatically feed into RSD, which is Rogue System Detection. It's the database within the EPO server. So that was a use case as ForScout finds devices, and we were able, 100% of the time, find the rogue devices before EPO or HBSS, because RSD are scans of segments, right, beacons, and it's time-based, where ForScout was finding things as soon as it plugged into the network. So the value that we could provide in saying, all right, as soon as something plugs in the network, do you have HBSS? If not, feed RSD. RSD fixed the device, and it immediately fixed a couple hundred devices in their network. On the flip side, HBSS finds an AV event. All it does is tell a human, and the human's got to go figure out and walk down that endpoint, figure out what's going on. By sending an alert to Counteract, Counteract was at least able to open a ticket for them and start some preliminary checking. So it was able to decrease the amount of times they had to go out there. So, so the two products worked really well together. We made each other stronger. And that was the very first sort of birth of our control fabric. And then we moved on to other tools like EI Retina and now Tenable and so on and so forth. And the rest is history. Okay. Yes?
With regard to this and the systems that you guys have used it on, how much of a decrease in like actual call volumes like helped you guys like cache any calls?
Yeah. Good question. So the question was, in the systems that we've used it on, how have we, I'm going to call it ROI, but what have we seen as far as an ROI when it comes to the number of calls to the help desk? And I can give you one example with the Marine Corps, in that they had a team of 16 that went around and did nothing but fix their endpoint issues. And after they were deployed with Comply to Connect, specifically that program, they were able to narrow it down to only 6. So they took 10 and they were able to reposition them in other organizations, but definitely saw a huge impact in that. Anyone else? All right. You all get a little bit of time. I got you. Dean's pointing me out. I won't forget. So I did have a special, I know I didn't make an announcement. I just wanted to see, but I do have a little special surprise. It's a speaker given by the speaker. And I was going to go by the best questions, but you definitely got best and most. So there's our little award. It's a ForScout speaker. So thank you very much for your audience participation. I love it every time. All right. Well, thank you. That wraps it up. Our booth is right on the other side of the big bubble over there. And if you have any questions, feel free to swing by. Christina can get you some T-shirts. You got T-shirts back here, right? I think we only have large, unless you found the box, Christina. So we only have large, but they're great T-shirts. She'll get you a T-shirt. All right. Thank you.